Russia has zero chance of winning the war in Ukraine. That's not speculation, that's the verdict from the former head of Britain's secret intelligence service, a man who spent his life studying wars, regimes, and the kinds of leaders who start them. 3 years into this brutal invasion, Sir Richard Dearlove says Putin's war machine is broken beyond repair, and his words aren't just bold, they're backed by facts. From mounting troop losses to collapsing cash reserves, from stalled offensives to plummeting morale. The former MI6 chief says the Kremlin is running out of options, and fast. So who is this man making one of the most damning assessments of the war to date? Let's find out. Sir Richard Dearlove is a retired British intelligence officer with a long and storied spy career. He joined the British Secret Intelligence Service, also known as MI6, in 1966, spending time in various countries around the world from Kenya to France, Switzerland and the Czech Republic, working his way up the ranks. By 1991, he was head of the MI6 Washington station, then became Director of Personnel and Administration in 1993, then Director of Operations in 1994. In 1999, he received his most important promotion, becoming the official Chief of MI6, a position he went on to hold for 5 years. He was in charge during the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center and the subsequent invasion of Iraq. He then left his role as head of MI6 in August 2005, going on to become a university administrator, lecturer, public speaker, writer, and political commentator. In short, this is a man who has devoted his life to geopolitics and has unique levels of experience in the field of military intelligence. When he speaks, people listen, as he knows what he's talking about. And in a recent interview with Sky News' The World, Sir Dearlove had some damning words to share about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Kicking off the interview, newscaster Gillian Joseph asked Dearlove if he shared the fears of European leaders around President Donald Trump possibly rushing through a ceasefire deal with terms that favor Russia and Putin. The former spy chief was unequivocal in his response. "I do recognize that fear, and I think that will be a poor outcome for Europe at this moment in time. I'm also worried by the way in which Steve Witkoff, Trump's negotiator with Putin, has been putting out what I would regard as a Russian narrative. I've said already on a couple of occasions that the worst deal will be an early ceasefire, which makes unnecessary concessions on the Russian side because Ukraine has been pushed to the table to negotiate to accept a ceasefire in principle, but we see absolutely no apparent concessions on Putin's part. As far as we can tell, his Ukrainian policy has no reverse gear. He is just asking for the maximum still. So I think the better outcome would be for us to continue to support the Ukrainians and not do an early deal that makes concessions to Russia." In Dearlove's view, this is not the time to negotiate a ceasefire. Instead, it's the moment for Ukraine to receive more consistent support from Western allies and to continue pushing back against Russian aggression. But why shouldn't world leaders push for an immediate end to the conflict? Well, according to Dearlove, it's because Russia is not in a particularly good place at the moment. In his view, negotiating a ceasefire right now would to an extent be better for Russia than it would for Ukraine. Putin could use his propaganda and pressure tactics, possibly backed by the Trump administration, to work out a deal that makes the Kremlin look like the grand victors of the war, potentially taking over large parts of Ukrainian territory and spreading the message across Russia that the war was worth it all along, that Putin is the greatest leader in Russian history and so forth. It will be a big win for the Kremlin, and not just in the short term, but also with long-term impacts for the future of European security, as Dearlove details. To allow Putin to, as it were, come out of this conflict claiming some sort of victory, I think, is perhaps almost the worst outcome for Europe, because it raises all sorts of questions for the future about European security. There's certainly a strong amount of truth to that statement. Fears have been rife across large parts of Europe about how Russia might decide to expand its territory even further, perhaps invading one of the Baltic nations or declaring war on NATO by pushing over the borders into Finland or Poland via Belarus. If Putin were able to negotiate a favorable ceasefire deal for Russia, he might start eyeing other countries for future invasions. If, however, he is forced into a more neutral ceasefire, or even one with favorable terms for Ukraine, he's likely to lack the backing he would need for those kinds of military actions, which could help secure more long-term peace across the European continent. But Dearlove's most damning words were still to come. When asked whether or not it was in Russia's interest to agree a ceasefire, he stated, "Well, the strange thing is I think Russia probably needs a ceasefire rather badly more than Putin realizes himself. The war has been a disaster. His leadership must be under question amongst the privileged kleptocrats around him who are not getting the deal they expected. They have significant economic and cash problems. Their reserves are running out, and the experts who analyze the military situation tell me that the Russian military is at a point where its future performance is likely downwards. Less motivation of its soldiers, less ammunition, less equipment on the battlefield. These are not empty words, there are numerous statistics to back them up. In 2024 alone, for example, Russia saw record losses of life in its war effort, with over 45,000 confirmed deaths. which is nearly 3 times more than the first year of the invasion and higher than the total for 2023 as well. If we look even closer at the figures, 2024 actually got progressively worse for Russia as it went on, with month-on-month increases in the death toll. Experts estimate that around 27 soldiers have been killed for every square kilometer of Ukrainian territory captured, which is less than 0.4 square miles. Over 106,000 Russian soldiers have been confirmed killed in the invasion so far, and many experts believe that the true number of deaths is actually much higher, rising to more than 230,000 in some estimates. Russia has been forced to adopt extreme recruitment policies to replenish its forces, going as far as offering one-time payments of close to $40,000 to those who join the fight, as well as forcefully drafting large numbers of young men to bolster its army. In early 2025, for example, Putin called up 160,000 men aged between 18 and 30, with plans to increase the overall size of the army to 1.5 million active duty members. There have also been reports and studies into Russian morale, with plenty of evidence to suggest that it's on the decline and has been dropping more or less consistently since the invasion began. Admiral Tony Radakin, the head of the British Armed Forces, summed up the mood. "We are unsurprisingly seeing disquiet at all levels within the Russian armed forces. You've seen it at the most junior level. We're also seeing the pressure that exists with their tactical and operational commanders, and then you get up to their most senior commanders who are clearly under pressure too." A collection of documents seized by the Ukrainian forces in 2024 also reinforces these claims. The document allegedly discussed major concerns on the Russian side about troop morale, citing the case of one frontline soldier who committed suicide after an extended period of depression and distress over his role in the Russian army. The documents also detailed Russian plans to boost morale, with unit commanders advised to make sure troops consume sufficient amounts of Russian state media on a daily basis, aimed at maintaining and raising the political, moral, and psychological condition of the personnel. Dearlove's claims about Russian cash reserves running out are also grounded in reality. Anders Aslund, a leading Swedish economist and former fellow of the Atlantic Council, stated that Russia could deplete its national wealth fund reserves as soon as fall of this year. The most critical shortage, however, is budget financing, as Russia's last liquid reserves are likely to run out in the fall of 2025. Budget cuts will then become necessary. In the meantime, the war economy might also require price controls and rationing, the old Soviet sins. As the risk of financial crash rises, Russia's imperiled economy is about to pose serious constraints on Putin's war. Aslund cited a range of factors to back up his claims, including the ever-declining value of the Russian ruble, a shortage of workers across the nation, high levels of inflation, and the impact of Western sanctions, which have made it much harder for Russia to borrow funds from other countries. Thanks to this, Russia's foreign debt has declined massively, from around $729 billion in 2023 to $293 billion in September 2024. Yet the country continues to spend heavily to solidify its war effort. Indeed, according to the 2025 budget, Russia is set to spend over $130 billion on defense alone in 2025, and its liquid reserves have diminished from $117 billion in 2021 to just $31 billion by late 2024. With less money and less capabilities to borrow from other countries, plus the continued impact of sanctions, Russia's economy is only getting weaker, in Aslund's view. Russian President Vladimir Putin frequently boasts about the strength of his country's economy, claiming that Western sanctions only made it stronger, while in the same breath demanding that they be lifted. In fact, stagflation, inflation combined with minimal growth, is coming to Russia. As far as equipment goes too, Russia's stocks are on the decline in many cases. Reports suggest that Russia has so far lost thousands of tanks and armored vehicles, along with large quantities of howitzers and self-propelled artillery systems. Exact figures and estimates vary, with data from Ukrainian general staff suggesting losses of close to 3,700 tanks, nearly 9,000 infantry fighting vehicles, over 13,000 artillery systems, and more than 400 air defense systems in 2024 alone. However, the British International Institute for Strategic Studies, the IISS, generally cuts these 2024 figures in half, but the IISS only takes into account destroyed vehicles. Even though Russia has an extensive stock of more than 130,000 armored vehicles in total, according to data gathered by Global Firepower, these losses are still significant. What's more, much of the Russian equipment being used in the invasion dates back to the Soviet era, with reports from the IISS suggesting that around 85% of the tanks and armored vehicles deployed so far come from long-term storage facilities, rather than being new or recently manufactured pieces of equipment. And those old Soviet stocks are being depleted, bit by bit. Indeed, satellite imagery of key Russian storage facilities shows that in some locations, more than 40% of stored tanks and vehicles have been forced into service, and plenty of the existing equipment that Russia has at its disposal is old, poorly preserved, and can't exactly be classed as combat ready. In addition, Russia is not capable of manufacturing new tanks, vehicles, artillery, and other equipment at the necessary rates to keep pace with its losses. As Nikolai Mitrokhin, a researcher with Germany's Bremen University, explains, armored vehicles are being put out of use with a horrifying speed. The production of new ones and the restoration of damaged or mothballed ones is far behind the losses. Mitrokhin also suggested that Russia's supply of armored vehicles would last mere months if the existing rates of losses persist. Lieutenant General Ihor Romanenko, the former deputy of Ukraine's General Staff of Armed Forces, largely agrees, though he suggests that Russian supplies may last a little longer than Mitrokhin's estimate. It's up to 2 years, considering the current losses they are suffering. Understandably, the share of modern armored vehicles, tanks, and other armored weaponry will be falling. Other experts, like Pavel Lutzin, a defense analyst at the Center of European Policy Analysis think tank, have shared more worrying news for Russia, stating that the country can, at best, manufacture up to 60 new tanks per year. That will not be enough to support a continued war effort, especially if Ukraine continues to receive aid from its allies and destroys more Russian tanks in the months to come. With massive losses in all key areas, finance, manpower, and military equipment, and bleak prospects as 2025 goes on, there's real evidence to suggest that Russia is losing this war and facing increasingly insurmountable odds. And Sir Dearlove summed it up best when asked if Russia was on the back foot. Their advances on the battlefield have slowed significantly in the last 3 months. At the current rate of progress, it would take them 80 years to conquer Ukraine. If you put it like that, they are unable to amass a significant force, which could break through Ukrainian lines in a serious way. What they're doing is they're sort of biting off very small sections of territory, and we've virtually got a frontline stalemate at the moment. More than 80 years, a bold statement, and one that will send shockwaves across the Kremlin. When Russia first invaded Ukraine, it seemingly expected to march all the way to Kyiv more or less unopposed. Indeed, reports later emerged that Russian soldiers had taken parade uniforms with them, and many expected their special military exercise to be completed in just 2 days, with victory parades in Ukraine and huge amounts of ground gained for Russia. Of course, it certainly hasn't panned out that way. Russia did not expect the Ukrainian people to rise and resist as strongly and consistently as they have. It did not expect the invasion to go on year after year, with months of effort and huge sacrifices to gain even a dozen miles of ground. Even now, after all the fighting, Russia has taken control of a little over 27,000 square miles of Ukrainian territory, representing around 12% of the nation. That figure rises to 19% when we include Crimea and parts of the Donbass region that Russia had already taken before the invasion began. That's still a large amount of land, but has come at a great cost, and is surely far from what Putin originally envisioned when he gave the orders to invade. If reports are true, he believed his forces would stroll into Ukraine, facing nearly no opposition and giving him an easy win. Now, if Dearlove's statement is accurate, a true Russian victory in this war would not come until many decades after Putin's own death, given that he is already 72 years of age. So given his views on Russia's current state, what does Dearlove suggest for Ukraine and its allies? The point is we need to sustain the Ukrainian war effort and maybe push this so that Russia is nearer to a point of crisis. According to Dearlove, it may prove more profitable for Ukraine in the long term if it keeps up the momentum for the time being, continuing to fend off Russian attacks and hold as much ground as it can. If it's able to do this and consistently take out more and more Russian troops and hardware, the tide of the battle will increasingly turn in its favor, and pressure will inevitably rise on Putin. Then when sufficient pressure is applied and Russia is in a weak enough state, with its economy collapsing, its morale at rock bottom, and the number of losses reaching record levels, ceasefire talks could begin and should provide a better result. That might include Russia agreeing to a full retreat, returning much of the territory it's taken to Ukraine. It would also represent a big hit for Putin and public support for the Kremlin as a whole, which should deter the Russian president from pursuing any further military maneuvers against Europe in the coming years. There's plenty of sense to Dearlove's words and plenty of evidence to reinforce his claims. While Russia has gradually made gains in Ukraine, progress has clearly been slow. The country's forces have massively struggled in the face of mighty Ukrainian resistance, and with major allies around the world continuing to supply Ukraine with funding and arms, there's no sign yet that Ukraine is about to buckle under pressure or wave a white flag. It will keep fighting to the best of its ability to make Russian gains as slow, difficult, and as costly as possible. As long as that continues, Russia will keep on feeling the effects, with deaths, injuries, and destruction of expensive military equipment. What's your take on this? Do you agree with Sir Dearlove that now is not the time for a ceasefire? Could it really take Russia 8 whole decades to win this war? And what are the next best steps for Ukraine and its allies? Share your thoughts in the comments section below.